Welcome to episode 224 of Silver Lining for Learning. We're going to discuss today digital caregivers, finding meaning with social robots. And with us today is David Crandall, who's the Luddy Professor of Computer Science at Indiana University. He's also the director of Luddy Artificial Intelligence Center and the director of the Center for Machine Learning. So say Mr. Luddy is involved in IU and has helped us build 2 buildings in the past decade. David received his degrees, PhD degree from Cornell, his master's and bachelor's from Penn State University. He's worked in a variety of settings and had been influenced and had funding from many different sources, including the US Navy, including NVIDIA, including Meta, or Facebook, the National Science Foundation, of course, Toyota, the Air Force, the list goes on and on. He's particularly interested in visual recognition and scene understanding. And Selma Sabanovic is also a professor in the Luddy School in informatics and cognitive science at IU, and she studies social robotics and human-robot interaction. Her interests are in mental health, wellness, education, social participation, and she's worked with all age groups, not just the elderly that we'll focus on at the beginning, at least here today, but from young to old, and working in various cultures, including East Asia, Europe, the US, and so forth. So we probably should get them to re-explain and elaborate on what I just said about each of them, but it's a pleasure to have both of them here today, not just because this article that I found in Wired magazine last year at this time got me excited, and I've been trying to get them on the show for 13 months, but also because they're right down the street from me in Luddy Hall, which I happen to have a couple of students who are getting their masters over there and their PhDs, and I enjoy every moment that I spend in their building because it's like a high-tech center. It's like a think tank over there. And so, first of all, David, would you like to fill in a little bit the gaps of your journey and what you're currently involved in?
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you for that introduction. That was great. Yeah, so as you said, I'm interested in computer vision mostly, like building systems that can understand the visual world around them. And there's been a lot of progress in this field in the last few years. I think the computer vision systems right now are pretty good at like recognizing things like writing a caption for a photo that's uploaded to social media or that's on your phone, this photo that you take. But they're much less good at sort of understanding the nuances of like social interactions, for example. So in a situation like this, we're talking to each other and I'm watching you for visual cues about whether I'm talking too little or too much or whether you're engaged in the sort of thing. And I think those sorts of things are completely beyond the scope of computer vision and right now. And so that's how I got excited about this project that Selma is really the brains behind. She's the expert in human robot interaction, but I got very interested in some of the technical components of it. And so maybe Selma should talk about a little bit about the project itself, maybe.
Before she goes, I'll just comment. Beyond right now is always a changing. Where beyond next year and the year, where we've come from the past 5 years has been due to people like you, and so we applaud your efforts. Selma.
Thank you also for the wonderful introduction. Happy to be here. I'm a social scientist, and as you mentioned, I focus on this kind of emerging area of social robotics, so robots that interact with people in some kind of social manner. And human-robot interaction, I tend to focus on kind of the human side of things. So David and I are like a wonderful yin and yang in this and other projects. And I think, some of the things that motivate me are one, this open-ended, very maybe artificial in various ways. I think we have a lot of
I'll have you
visions
repeat the last 2 sentences because we had a little delay.
Oh, sorry.
Your
Okay.
internet was
Yeah.
delayed. So why don't you repeat the last 2 sentences?
Sure. Last being with the motivation part.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, so what motivates some of my work are perhaps two different threads. So one is thinking about what our visions and imaginations are of how robots and other kinds of socially assistive agents can actually help people. And then working with the people who we would like to help or who we think might use these kinds of technologies to actually understand what they also think about this and how they can really use these new emerging technologies. And so I think this project was a really great combination of those things, both taking a very maybe forward-looking perspective on having some kind of human-like conversational, robotic, moving technology agent that can talk to people, and then at the same time working very closely with older adults and with caregivers to understand what kinds of needs they have and how they might actually incorporate these new robots, these new technologies into their everyday life.
So can we focus on that at the start, at least the older population that you're dealing with? Because that was what was featured in the Wired magazine piece. But the way you've explained it, it's not necessarily your entire interests and your research agenda. But let's start there and go more broad maybe. Did they accurately depict what you're doing in the Wired magazine first off? Was there things that they left out or things that you're planning to do that didn't get into that particular piece?
Yeah, so they actually worked with us off and on for about a year, right, David? First initially having a kind of conversation interview with us. Then the journalist came and visited us in the lab. She also went with us to the memory care facility where we did some of our design and evaluation work. She saw how people interacted with the robots. She even came, and it's in the piece, you may have noticed it, but she visited us through a telepresence robot and attended some of our co-design, collaborative participatory design meetings with older adults. So I think I think we love that article. I think they did an amazing job kind of both following what we do and, interpreting and putting it in a bigger picture, which I think is really important. Of course, that piece came out last year, so we've done some things since then. And the project came out from conversations with Toyota Research Institute and our collaborator there, Dr. Kate Tsui. And we were really interested in, we all knew we were interested in doing some kind of social robotics project. Both Toyota Research Institute and ourselves have had a kind of enduring interest in working with assistive robots for older adults. It's a very important kind of population that is being designed for in the field in general. And of course, there's always a desire to kind of bolster and enhance the available, healthcare, wellness, kind of system and ecology around older adults. So that was kind of the broad vision that we initially had. But then through conversations with Kate and then with all of our students and David and his students, some other aspects of the project came out. So I think one of the things that we've really been wanting to focus on and to do is not to just have this vision of, okay, there's a robot and an older adult and we leave it there. We want to understand how these things fit into the broader care network and the whole, diverse group of people that are around older adults, the caregivers who might be, or care partners, as we like to say, who are working with them on a day-to-day basis. And we want to think about it not so much as, oh, we want older adults to engage with our robot. We want to use the robot as a mediator so that they actually are really, it's more about connecting older adults with other people and with the kinds of things that, they care about, that give them joy, that make their life meaningful. And so one of the reasons why we decided to do a conversational robot was because we kind of understood from the beginning that these sources of kind of purpose in life, as we say, can come from many different places. And in order for the robot or for any kind of system to really be able to make any recommendation or, try to assist in some way, we need to understand that better. So we wanted to figure out activities in different ways where the robot could get to know the person. And so we developed several different kinds of conversations, basically, from a chat to a photo activity to some reflection activities, so that the robot could both kind of get to know the person, develop a profile of them, a user profile, but also I always think of it as, as the person talks to the robot is kind of a mirror. So it's almost like it's a, a way of assisting someone to kind of think about, their own situation, their own sense of purpose, kind of reflect on themselves. And since we did that article, we've tested the system in lots of different ways in the lab, in some elder care facilities. Some people even took it and used it in their home for a couple of weeks. And some of the things that people have said about using it have been promising, or we found promising. So, sometimes people talk about being able to talk to the robot about things they maybe would not mention to people because they're not maybe ready to talk to other people about it, or sometimes even realizing things about themselves that they hadn't maybe thought about or realized because they were being kind of, questioned and asked and, in this conversation, in this dialogue with the robot. So those are some of the things we've done since then. But David can also maybe tell you a little bit about some of the technical development that's come up as part of the project.
Before we move to David, just a couple comments. Last week, we had the developer of Jill Watson on this show. So it is a conversational chatbot that, the students didn't realize was not a human giving them feedback at first, and has been expanded. And they have some exciting data there as well. And as this show is a conversation, the last show was about a conversational bot, and today as well. So it's nice to have that connection between two episodes. So anyone who's using these podcasts later on in your classes, you might use both of these in the future for your students to reflect on, do papers on, or whatever. Before we go to David, the Wired magazine article tended to focus on dementia patients, but it seems like that's not your entire focus. In fact, is it a small piece? Is it a major piece? I mean, and what is the sample size like, in that regard?
Yeah, so we started initially developing this for older adults more generally, and we've done some of the development work and the evaluations as well with a broader population of older adults. But as a kind of subpopulation, we've also focused more closely on older adults with dementia. We have a memory care facility that's relatively close to the university and that we've worked with over many years, even before this project, on some other projects, that is for older adults with dementia. And so, one, we wanted to understand how this could be used by a more cognitively diverse group of people. But then we also found that for older adults and with dementia and their caregivers, this system seemed to have particular kind of affordances that seemed particularly useful. For example, one of the activities that we developed with David and his team is, you can show a photo to the robot, and the robot will recognize what's in the photo, and then it can talk to you about what's in there. And so, that's an interesting way to maybe learn something about people, but it's also a way for people to kind of do some memory work, kind of actually remember things themselves. And so, people have found that to be just a useful activity in the memory care space generally. And then, we got a lot of feedback from care partners that, this kind of system might be helpful in, helping older adults remember certain things or setting goals, giving reminders, et cetera. So yeah, the article focused on older adults with dementia, and we definitely, continue to work with them as a specific kind of subpopulation of older adults, but we've been interested in older adults more generally too.
That's what I thought. David?
Yeah, and so on sort of the technical side, I think this project raises all kinds of really interesting questions, and it's really hard. The whole problem is really hard. You know, imagine you want this to build this robot that can have a natural conversation with someone, say an older adult, maybe living with dementia, maybe not, but either way, maybe not super familiar with technology. You want it to be you want the conversation to be meaningful. You want it to avoid ethical difficulties, all sorts of things. And so, like, even at the very, so I think sometimes of the technical challenge that we faced and that we're still studying in terms of like kind of low level, micro level kinds of things, and also sort of high level things. So, like, micro level is just like, what should the voice of the robot sound like? Because you want a voice that people are going to maybe trust, maybe they're going to feel comfortable with it. What kind of vocabulary should it use? Is the person at any moment in time actually talking to me, the robot, or not? Or am I hearing the TV? Or is the person talking to a caregiver or something instead? When is the person done talking? When is it the robot's turn to talk? And if any of these things are you get wrong, the conversation can rapidly go off the rails. You know, the robot hears the person saying something, they're actually saying it to somebody else. The robot tries to answer, the person gets confused, they interrupt the person. It can quickly go bad. And so even at the kind of micro level that we just take for granted, you know, as we're doing this right now, it's actually really difficult. And then there's sort of more the medium and high level issues like how can you tell whether the person's actually engaged in the conversation or not? Are they getting bored? Should we change the topic? Are there sort of emotional, are there kind of difficult emotions coming up and how to deal with them? As you can imagine, older adults who are talking about like in the case of the photo activity Selma mentioned, they might be showing the robot a picture of a loved one that's died or something, and how should the robot like detect and manage those kinds of questions that come up, and it's really you know, we've had cases in all the studies where Selma talked about where like clearly the person didn't want to talk about a topic anymore, but the robot kept asking and it kept asking, tell me more about your deceased husband. You know, it's probably not the right way of phrasing that question. And then there's sort of the very high level questions like what kind of activities would be engaging to the older adult? What kind of activities would be useful that the robot could sort of help direct? What kind of questions are going to be useful to bring up to the older adult? Which one should be avoided? That sort of thing. And so I think at every like level of this technical stack, I'll say, I think there's really interesting technical questions. And like Selma said, you know, especially maybe older adults or older adults living with dementia, a lot of these questions are even more magnified or more interesting than with other kind of social chat bot kind of situations.
Interesting. All of this is fascinating. We're going to go Chris, then Lydia, then Punya. Chris, you want to jump? I introduced my co-hosts. Chris Stidi is with us from Harvard. Punya Mishra is with us from Arizona State, and Lydia Kao is with us from the University of Toronto. Go ahead, Chris.
So you mentioned therapy, and I have some thoughts about that. It seems to me that one kind of low-hanging fruit would be you indicated that the robot could be kind of a conduit to other people, which I think is a really good idea. And the robot could perhaps use analytics to understand some things that might want to communicate to somebody like a staff member at the home. Maybe it would say, this person seems more confused. And maybe you should check if there's a medical reason, or it could say this person seems to be obsessing about something. They keep coming back to it, and you may want to think about what that means. And David, you're right that is not easy. In the institute that I'm part of, one of our major areas of foundational AI is mutual theory of mind. And when you have an older person and say a staff member and say an AI assistant, each has a mutual theory, each has a theory of mind for the other two. And what the AI has a theory of mind is itself complicated. And then, you know, what the other two have is their theory of mind is complicated. But it certainly seems worth pursuing. That said, as you're aware, there's a lot of controversy about the level of therapy that chatbots can provide. And this, of course, goes all the way back to ELIZA. When I was a graduate student, and Joseph Weizenbaum's work, and people spending hours talking to ELIZA thinking they were getting therapeutic advice. The chatbots today don't understand any more about therapy than ELIZA did. They're better at faking it. But large language models that go word by word are not capable of giving therapeutic advice that's tailored to an individual, in my opinion. And so I'm wondering how you navigate through ways in which the chatbot within its limitations could be helpful, and ways in which people, because of the ELIZA effect, where anything that talks, they think it's smarter than it is, ways that people might overuse your social robot in ways that would be unfortunate.
Yeah, so I think we generally never intended or have ever kind of presented the robot as a therapeutic device. And I think the other, so we're not expecting the robot to be in and of itself something that provides like a therapeutic experience to a person. And then secondly, so there's always a care partner or other kind of clinician or caregiver who is, in our studies, there was always somebody in the general area who was actually also listening to the conversations, so that it wasn't that the person was having the experience kind of all alone. And then secondly, we've always thought about how this fits into, a broader conversation between the older adult and other people in their kind of social and healthcare sphere, rather than as a, we could give this robot to an older adult and they could put it in its home and it would be kind of self-sufficient for them. So yeah, so I don't think we ever imagined, I agree with you that, the capability of any kind of machine to, administer therapy on its own could be very, ethically troubling and suspect, to say the least. And so our focus has been on thinking through how do we kind of get some relevant and important and knowledge about the person, so we can at least have activities that are or conversations that are pertinent and interesting to them, so we could, if we want to, gather some of the, like you're mentioning, analytics and things. So whether they're things about how the way that the person is talking, or changes that you might notice over a period of time. We first kind of focused on, so what are activities that would be actually kind of inherently useful to people so that they would want to use this thing, and therefore there could be some further benefits. And the second part was, so we designed this through a co-design process. So we basically had older adults and both with and without dementia, and their care partners come to the lab, and basically over a period of about 18 months, they would come every few weeks, and we would show them things we had developed for the robot, and they would try it out, give us feedback. We would talk about questions, both kind of what should the robot ask, how should it develop a user profile, what should its voice or gestures or feedback be like. How would you use this, like if you had a day in the life and you were going to have these kinds of activities that we've decided that we're going to develop, like what would this look like as something that you use? What kind of feedback could you get from it? What kind of feedback could your care partner get from it? So I think the way that I imagine these, of kind of navigating the issue of therapy and the limitations of technology is to make sure that there are always humans in the loop, and that the humans in the loop are aware of both the capabilities but also the limitations of the technology, so when they're using it, they can kind of use it with those things in mind. And so But of course, I mean, you also say like, yeah, when this thing talks to you, and we did GPT kind of came out at some point in the project, and it was great in the sense of suddenly this thing could have a great conversation, but also not great because the conversation, the kind of conversation it could have is way beyond actually its comprehension level, right? And so some of the things we also kept in the project are things that actually alert people to the fact that this is just a robot. So we kind of deliberately used a more, I don't know, like not toy, but like a robot look. It's a very robot looking robot. It's kind of yay big and looks like a little white astronaut. It has a cartoony face. It would introduce itself. It had a backstory, and it would introduce itself and reiterate that it's a robot. It's we didn't fix some of the things that made it seem less kind of human-like and less robotic, partly on purpose because we wanted people to constantly be kind of made, aware in some way, shape, or form that this is really not a person, and therefore is not giving a person level kind of relationship or feedback. So those are some of the things I think we focused on to address some of that. But maybe, I don't know if David has some other, I do have one more thing, which is David was mentioning, these emotions and things. We really have been trying to work on how it can address some of these emotional things that people experience during these conversations, but with the idea that we, may not have a caregiver who's constantly like ready to jump in like we were during the study, so that the robot could at least not be such a klutz and ask about the deceased friend or pet or family member constantly in the moment. But, I think if anything that was, emotional happened, that's something that would be translated back to the care partners so that they're also aware.
David?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Selma said. I think the one key thing that I'll just echo is that I think the focus of this project and what I was almost surprised about by the project is that it was really good about building for building community among people as opposed to between people and the robot. And so, for example, something that was surprising to me is it seems like the robot makes some mistakes that are bad, but other mistakes that are actually sort of beneficial in some ways to building community. So, I'm thinking, for example, in the bad category I'm thinking about one older adult who was interacting with the robot, and the robot was having a bad day. I don't know. It kept interrupting them. And so the older adult was saying, "Oh, I'm so bad at technology. I knew I wouldn't be able to work this robot right." And we're all thinking, "No, it's not your fault. It's the robots." And that's why there's a caregiver and people in the room who can pull the plug or whatever if needed. But then what also struck me is that a lot of times the robot would say kind of weird things with a group of people there. And I'm thinking here of this one demo that we did in a community center in Japan, actually, where the robot we had to program the robot to understand and speak in Japanese, but it wasn't, exactly perfect. And so it would say some kind of strange things. And then the people in the room who are interacting with the robot who were strangers to one another, were laughing and they're saying, "What did it mean? Oh, I think it meant this," and so on. And so it was like, the robot almost became like a pet or something like that, where it provided this way of people to communicate with one another and so, to interact with one another in sort of this interesting, non-threatening way. And I'll just maybe emphasize one more thing, which is that I think one of the most difficult parts of the project and really the most impressive, I think, is the work that Selma and her team led on the co-design part, because I think this is really an innovative idea. At least I'm speaking here as a computer scientist. I think a lot of computer scientists are like, here I'm going to create this system, and then here's your system. Older adults living with dementia, good luck. I'll be someplace else. I'm working on the next project now. And that's not a way of building something that's actually going to be useful to people and beneficial to their lives. But it's a lot of work to do what Selma did, which is to bring in this panel of older adults, every 2 weeks or so for like 3 years. And the older adults didn't necessarily know anything about robotics or AI ahead of time. So there's this process of trying to get them up to speed on what it is that they're interacting with, what is the right terminology to use, what are the possibilities, what kinds of features do they like, what kind of features do they not like, and I think that was really valuable and really special about this project. It created not just like a technical artifact, but it also created this whole community of students and older adults and researchers and roboticians and AI folks who really started like understanding each other better.
I think Punya's going to jump in before Lydia. Punya.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing. I've been following this work actually for quite a while, partly because early on when I was at Michigan State, I did quite a bit of work on sort of social responses to media and building on sort of the Greaves and Nass kind of stuff and looking at what it meant in educational context, like basically motivation, willingness to continue on a task, praise versus blame, sort of interesting questions there. But one of the things that I want us to, and again, just to want to be very clear, I love the work that you guys do, but I think there are broader sort of social implications here that I want us to dig into a little bit. The research shows that humans pretty readily will attribute agency, intentionality, psychological beliefs, and states to interactive objects. And now we have these which are using natural language, which can use emotional language and have extended conversations. And sometimes because of the sort of confabulatory nature of that, they actually sound more realistic because they are not very scripted, right? And so we have this. And then I think the other piece that's really interesting that you talked about is these cultural differences too. I think Japanese culture, for instance, is a little more open to the idea of robotic partners and, and things that way. And I'm just thinking of something like Sherry Turkle talked about, that how social interaction, human to human, have the social friction, which is essential. And particularly, I mean, Selma, if you want to talk about like the work that you've done with younger people, because that's where I think you're developing your social brain and interaction. So I'm wondering, how are you thinking about this sort of potential benefits and possible risks in the long term? I'm seeing this in education right now, where increasingly education is being seen in such instrumental terms, and AI is going to do it, replace teachers, and that kind of a conversation is increasingly coming to the forefront. And I'm just wondering how you see this sort of playing out in the long term in terms of what are we gaining, losing. Sometimes I wonder about when we talk about teachers and we say, oh, their jobs are so difficult, so AI can help them, instead of asking the more foundational question of why have we made our teachers' jobs so difficult? That's a deeper and maybe a more difficult question to answer, but maybe the more important one. So I'm just throwing a lot of things out there. Again, because you've been working in this space, I would love to hear how you are thinking about some of these broader issues. And it seemed to flow, I think, from Chris's conversation. So I thought that I should jump in. So approach it, whoever wants to go first, approach it any which way you want. But there are, I think, some broader things that we might want to, that I'm personally selfishly sort of interested in.
Well, we can maybe work on this one together, David. Yeah, it is very broad. I mean, I guess some other things that come up with just working with older adults and clinicians, or I guess a lot of stuff that I'm really excited about and surprised by is kind of understanding our assumptions, and understanding that sometimes our assumptions are not borne out by the people that we end up interacting with. So on the one hand, I think there's a expectation, that older adults will and caregivers might just like immediately take to these things and really want to use them and deploy them and be excited about them, or on the other hand, reject them completely because they're, too technological and hard to use and those kinds of things. And I think both of those things were not true of the folks we worked with. I think people are, both the older adults and the, any of the clinicians or therapists or others that we've worked with, they actually have quite nuanced understandings if not necessarily of technology in the beginning, of kind of their needs and, what it means to, be aging, and what I think social norms and social expectations of older adults are, and how they don't fit them in some sense. And they really want to like question those and critique them in terms of robot design. And so I think one of the things that I see the research doing is actually providing a space for that. So in some sense, it's not, I mean, yes, we're designing an artifact, but I think aside from the artifact that we design, this kind of providing a space to have this conversation with a broader set of participants about, like our assumptions, their assumptions, how we can all meet in one space and what's possible, I think is really, really beneficial. Of course, I think the danger is that, once one of these kinds of technologies is available, even though the initial aim isn't to, just hand it over to people and leave them alone with it, this can still happen, right? So although in some sense, I think, robotic technologies still need significant amounts of help. So I think really the thing is thinking about how do they change work in some sense. And that's kind of another set of questions that we do have and that we are looking at is, if you're putting these robotic assistive technologies into elder care or other kind of healthcare spaces, like how does it actually change the nature of work of clinical staff, and what do we need to think about in terms of training, in terms of like how many more people do you actually need to have there to use these robots in the appropriate way? And then how do you think about either additional burden that you're putting on caregivers or some other ways of maybe thinking about what their current work is like, and how the technology might alleviate burden. So I think if we keep that in mind, hopefully we can kind of go away from the myth in some sense of autonomous technology, which I think robots always bring with it. It kind of seems like somebody will make this thing and it will suddenly do, fix the problem by itself. But in the end, this is never true. Like there are always people who have to continue kind of supporting it, maintaining it, fixing it. I think in all of our studies with older adults, and we've also done some with like robotic pets, how do you introduce the person to the technology? How do they end up sitting in front of it and actually engaging with it? How do you make sure the different people in the nursing home have access to it at the appropriate time? What is the appropriate time, right? Like all of those things are not things that really the technology can do by itself. It's really about the people. So I think, along with the design of the technology, thinking more broadly about the organizational setting and labor. And, in some sense, the NSF has had this future of work kind of subsec or funding stream for a while now, which I think is really important when it comes to these technologies. So I guess in terms of trying to address some of these potential dangers of, right, like people misunderstanding or over relying on or kind of overusing in some sense the technology, my hope is that through kind of really attending to the broader picture of where these things fit in, and then developing, the training, the mutual understanding, developing the activities so that it's clear that, there are people constantly there in the loop in various ways. My hope is that that kind of addresses some of it. But I think we have to keep critically thinking about it and questioning it as we go along. Like it's not just in the design moment, it's kind of consistently afterwards as well.
Sure. Thank you for that. And I think, David, just to emphasize something you said before, which is the sort of the co-design piece, I think becomes critical in that arena. So I don't know, David, if you wanted to add something.
Sure. I mean, I like 10,000% agree with what Selma said. I mean, I think, and I say this as the director of an AI center and as someone who studied, a computer scientist who studied AI for 25 years. I don't think AI is a magic solution to most problems. I'm not even sure it's a magic solution to any problem, actually. I mean, just, AI alone. And that's why even though I'm, trained as a computer scientist, I really think that we need to take like a human-centered approach to AI development. And I think so much of the history of AI has been posing the problem as like trying to replicate or replace people's abilities. But, very generally, I think that isn't what the future is. The future, at least the future I want to live in, is about, developing AI that makes people happier, more effective, reduces some of the work they don't want to do while helping them free up time for things that they do want to do, making them more effective in that classroom or whatever. And I think maybe if I can put in a plug here for university research, I'll say, right now AI, a lot of AI work is happening in companies, which is great because they have a lot of resources, they have a lot of money, but they also have a very different motivation than what like Selma and I do. Selma and I work for the taxpayers of Indiana, basically, and we're not making money at all off of this robot that we're developing because we're motivated to answer, scientific questions about like what is the right kind of design space and what kinds of things should we do and what kinds of things shouldn't we do. And we're not driven by trying to get a couple of extra people to click on our ads or something like that. And of course, there's trade-offs in that. I mean, I think we had about a dozen or so students working on this project over the course of 3 years. I don't think with our budget we could have like hired a single Silicon Valley software engineer probably to work on the project. And so, the scale of our resources are much less, but we're also trying to, answer more fundamental questions that are like exactly like the things that you're bringing up, Punya.
So thank you, David, for that plug, because I think this is, if there is a moment where that a recognition of the work that is done at the universities from the taxpayer sort of point of view, for the betterment of all, not for the bottom line or whatever it is, I don't think there's a better moment. So thank you for that. And I sort of tongue in cheek wrote this blog post a while back where I said that when they were organizing the Dartmouth conference, the idea was to call it the Cybernetics Conference, but I'm forgetting the name of the person who wrote the proposal, hated Robert Wiener, so he decided to call it AI instead. And I think, I wrote sort of what the field would have looked like if it had been called cybernetics. A lot of sort of the attributions that we are making now, because the word intelligence is used in there, would maybe have been mitigated somewhat. But thank you. I know Lydia has been waiting very patiently. I will hop off and let her ask her question.
Maybe it was John McCarthy who did the
I
blog
think
post.
yes, that's right. I just blanked on that name. Yeah, yeah, it's it was just a nice, fun thought experiment to run.
I'm really curious about the kind of interaction between a robot and an elderly. And I'm curious how they engage with the robot and how do they perceive the robot? And David, you earlier mentioned like they see when robot make funny mistakes, they see it as like kind of like a pet and which foster like then human connections. And how, like what kind of interaction do they have and what role do they play and how they are being perceived?
I can try going first. So I think we've seen all kinds of interactions. I mean, some of them have been, in some sense, great failures. Part of, people just being like, what is this? I don't want to interact with it. So, it's definitely like in no case are these technologies something that everyone is in. Like you can design it as much as you like it's not going to work for everyone. And I think in some sense, like the people that we worked with throughout the study have been such good sports as we've kind of trial and errored together through designing these things, just laughing at mistakes and, kind of bonding around the quirks of the robot. I still won't forget the robot, for some reason, we programmed this, so for some reason is us, but it used to like when it would kind of do this like action like this with its arms is like a woo, like yay, kind of thing. But I mean, this is not a typical thing that you do when you're having a conversation with people. And when we were testing it with our co-design group, the robot would do this all the time. And by the end of the co-design group, like everybody in the meeting would just do this like woo as like a greeting for each other. So, so I think that's what, partly what comes to mind when David is talking also about like the robot creating its own community. I think, I mean, some of the interactions that people had, I feel like surprised us and maybe surprised them as well. And actually, when I talked to the robot, I surprised myself because it was, I think Chris was mentioning this a little earlier, it was super easy to have the kind of Eliza effect where you're just having this conversation. It keeps asking you more and more deep questions, and you just keep, really keep kind of going there with it. And I think some of the things that were interesting in terms of what people said is, I think this was from a Japanese conversation, but a conversation in Japan. Somebody said, the robot is a really good listener. That's what they thought. And they really enjoyed the fact that they could feel like they were heard. And because people often don't listen and don't hear you and they actually liked, the robot would kind of listen to the conversation, and you could say like, do you want me to summarize what we've talked about? And the robot would basically summarize and tell you like, you told me about how much you love to cook and how you love making pie, and you particularly enjoy making pie with your kids, and whatever. They really liked that, which seems, it's not like a thing we would have in normal conversations. But it basically gave them the notion that, okay, somebody actually listened to what I said, and they can now, repeat it back to me. They knew it was a robotic thing. I mean, they knew that it wasn't like, this thing is deeply understanding them. But the other thing that sometimes people mention that they would enjoy is the fact that if this thing knew stuff about them, and this was particularly in some of the conversations with people with dementia, that it could later remind them about things that they might have, forgotten, for example. And so, I think, yeah, the interactions ran the gamut from, this is stupid to this is funny to this is actually like unexpectedly engrossing. And I think, 3 years seems like a long time, but in some sense for a project from scratch, it's not like so long. I feel like we just, scratched the surface of what might be interesting or possible. So I think, we're exploring some other directions later on. But I know David has some favorite interactions too, so maybe he can share those.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I've been struck by how, so occasionally it seems like someone really kind of engages with the robot in some really interesting way. And we've done a lot of demos with this robot just in sort of outreach to general public. So there was a AI for Good symposium at the United Nations in Geneva that we've presented this at, I guess, twice now. And like we presented at various other things around campus and at my nephew's elementary school and so on. And what's happened actually 3 times now is that there'll be a child or a teenager who will interact with the robot for a really extended period of time. And this has happened 3 separate times. Afterwards, the parent will come up to us and be like, hey, that was amazing. I've never seen my child like be so engaged in a conversation before. And I don't know what that is about. I don't know if it's about, kids who are maybe on the autism spectrum, or if it's kids who are, feel like they don't really have as much social interaction as they'd like. But like the things that have come up there are that like the robot conversation is sort of very transactional. Like you say something, then it says something. There's a lot less maybe anxiety about when, what you should say, when you should say, this thing isn't judging you, and so on. And so that's something that surprised me. I also remember there was when we were presenting in Japan, there was an older adult who sort of hung out to the very end, and once everyone else had left, asked us if she could spend some time talking to the robot by herself. And we're like, I mean, we were in the room still, but and she was having this very deep conversation about one of her friends who had died, and so I don't know if this is good or if this is bad. It gets back to things Chris was saying, but it's just striking how sometimes, even though this thing is really just a bit of software running on this computer, the fact that it's a robot, can sort of engage people in a way that maybe wouldn't happen otherwise.
And I guess just to put another thing in there, I mean, the other thing that I think was really interesting, along with sometimes kind of going with the interaction, the magic or whatever, people could also were very critical and like in very nuanced ways about things that worked and didn't work with the robot. So, you know, we've had older adults, you know, kind of critique in detail the surface nature of the interaction, right? If this is, you know, how the artificiality and the lack of authenticity, like we've had those Sherry Turkle conversations with the
Sure.
group. You know, people have commented on, you know, wanting to have the nonverbal cues and the verbal cues fit better. And, you know, kind of what level of emotional expression and empathy is appropriate or not appropriate, right? Like that it's not always okay for the robot to pretend that it can empathize and or to assume that it needs to empathize with certain things people say. So I think, you know, aside from the interactions with the robot, I think really these kind of moments where people are, you know, learning about the technology, but also bringing their own kind of human experiences into it, into conversation with some of the things the technology can currently do. I think those were some things that were very intriguing to us.
So just had a quick comment there, connecting something that Chris had mentioned earlier, and David, something that you said that resonated with me, is this whole idea of the theory of mind. And you know, you go back to the 1940s, there are these studies by Heider and Simmel, I think, where they showed these little animations of triangles and, you know, circles running around. And they asked people, what do you see? And people always came up with stories full of intentionality and agency and psychological attributes to these like triangles and so on, right? Except in their studies, they had like one or two people who would describe it brutally as a triangle moved from the left to the right to the. So there is this individual difference, I think, and you know, and if you look at Simon Baron-Cohen's work around theory of mind, and you know that how some of those have actually gone across lineages of engineers and generations. So I think that's also, I think, a really important piece. I just wanted to underscore that just as in everything, there is going to be incredible variability in human responses, just sort of who we are and our experiences and our natural, you know, sort of our instincts. And then you add sort of the cultural aspect to it. And so you get a really complicated mix of things, which I think, again, underscores the value of the work that you guys are doing and the criticality with which you're approaching it, right? So I think that companies wouldn't do that. They will market it as, here is your companion and it's going to take care of your loved one. While I hear a lot more nuance in this conversation, which I really appreciate. So thank you for that.
Thank you. And in terms of the cultural bit, I also wanted to point out, like I've done other research in Japan, and I have some other kind of cultural research on robots in Japan as well now, with some collaborators at Cornell. But one of the things I think that was interesting about working with folks in Japan is not that they were more accepting, it's actually that they were more nuancedly critical. Like they had many more ideas of what they wanted potentially the robots to do and not do. And then they had a lot more just like in-depth critique of how well this robot did or did not do. So in some sense, I think when often when we speak of, you know, robots in Japan, I think people expect like, okay, you give people a robot and they're really like, yeah, no, it was just like that. Yeah, they had more exposure to them, but it also created a much more kind of knowing public, and a much more discerning potential user. And so I think it was really interesting to work with them as well.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I know, Kurt, you had a
Yeah.
comment because I'm just looking at the time.
Yeah, we're getting near the end. I will say I flew to Japan last year and I got my run in at 9:30 at night. And then my friend met me in a restaurant close by. And we had robots serving us. So yeah, we do have expectations in Japan. I think I'm gonna have to bring your robot with me on some of my adventures, Selma. Do you have it with you that you could hold it up so we could see it? Is it close by or?
I'm at home. The robot is in the lab. I could like find you a picture of it if you.
Yeah, we can maybe share it on screen, but So
Yeah.
I have a book called The World is Open, How Web Technology is Revolutionizing Education. And I go all around the world, everyone goes like this. My brothers and sisters, when they meet me, they go like this. They will take family pictures. So I'll take the robot with me, we'll do this. I'm wondering, given all that you've said, I'm sure you're going to get people who are listening to the show later, watching the show later, excited and wanting to know more. This seems like a ripe area to do more with, such as hold a summit, an institute, a conference, or write a book. Do either of you, or have you both, thought about writing a book about this or holding a summit about this with other researchers in the same area? And if you have already and you've planned it out, is there something coming up in the future that one might want to attend and partake in or contact you about when it's maybe in the thought mode right now and they might want to contact you later to see what actually happened? So you want to talk about the future a little bit, also the future of this project.
Yeah, so with this project, we're actually continuing to analyze data. We had these deployments in homes and elder care facilities, and where people just use the robot for 2 weeks, which was, of course, fascinating to have an opportunity to do. So we're currently kind of analyzing to see what happened. And we have other offshoots from this. Some of them are more technical, kind of looking at developing foundational capabilities for the robot, like as in the nonverbal and turn taking and those kinds of things to help support better engagement with people. And some of them have to do with actually working more with older adults with dementia and their caregivers and running some of the, you had mentioned, Chris, analytics that could be potentially helpful in figuring out with them, like, what is helpful, how is it helpful to you, in what cases is it helpful, how would you use it, and those kinds of things. So those are some things about the future of the robot. And I think now I'm going to do that scary thing where you share something on Zoom, but there's the robot. This is just from one of our, do you see it? Yeah, so that's Iris, interactive robot for Ikigai support. And this is one of the interactions with an older adult. So now you know what it looks like. But maybe David can tell you about some of the upcoming kind of AI, healthcare, robots, et cetera, related events that we have soon.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you,
Oh,
David. There you go.
maybe there's something at IU that I can attend, David.
Yeah, here's a picture of this is our postdoc Wesley, who's setting up the robots at the UN. Yeah, so we have a variety of things coming up. I don't know if there's anything specifically related to robotics, but there is in April here at IU a workshop in AI in healthcare. We're doing one in AI in music in March. So there's a lot of AI plus X coming up. And Selma literally wrote a book on human-robot interaction last year. So Selma and I are the presidents of each other's fan clubs, so we can, but she has a book called Human-Robot Interaction and Introduction, I think, right? That's right. So folks could check that out also.
And I think we're always, we're always writing up things. I don't know that we thought about writing a book on this particular project, but I think sometime over the summer, we're going to do another community-related AI and healthcare meeting as well with another project that we've had for a while, which is an AI Institute planning grant with the NSF. So really trying to engage more with the community and kind of figuring out what are people's needs, where should we be targeting development based on, what folks may want to see or what could kind of help them in the shorter term.
Well, it's been great having you both on the show. And now I'm thinking I should have my students in emerging learning technologies meet you both at some point, because we're right here on the same campus. It's great having Indiana University colleagues with us today. We've learned a lot. This has been a really exciting show that's touched on a lot of different areas, both psychosocial as well as technological and funding, economic, and so forth. But we have to start thinking about the next show, unfortunately. And Lydia is going to tell us a little bit about it. It'll be in 2 weeks. We're going to take a week off for a pre-spring break sabbatical for all of us. Lydia.
Sure. The next show will be on March 8th, which is International Women's Day. So we have the pleasure to bring three female working in the computer education space. So we have two teachers, as well as a researcher from MIT. They will be sharing their work on everyday AI, teacher perspectives on AI education, and teacher professional development for advancing AI literacy in inclusive middle school classroom. So stay tuned for the next episode.